Congressman, could you tell us what you're doing? We all know, but what you're doing specifically here in Orange County, Villa Park?
Well, we're with Rotary this morning, and we're talking about some of the issues that impact us all, and the most impactful right now is the deficit in Washington, D.C., the spending that's going on, which is $1.5 trillion of deficit a year, and what we need to do in order to change that. What we need to do is to cut spending, and we're going to talk a little bit today about the different government boondoggles and wasteful programs that need to be shaved or closed down in order to put us back on a glide path towards a balanced budget.
Okay, great. On a personal level,
yes.
The budget being in the news a lot,
right.
You as a congressman, what's been your biggest, proudest moment so far in your political career?
Well, this is not anybody's proudest moment right now, because regardless, I'm a deficit hawk. I chaired the Pork Busters Coalition, so I've gone on after a lot of government programs. But we've reached the point now where with all the spending that, especially after the last 4 years, when you know, we've got this new entitlement for Obamacare. Let me tell you, we cannot afford this. It's over $1 trillion new pressure on the overall spending and debt, and it takes $500 billion out of Medicare, which is already going to go bankrupt in 8 years. It takes that money, and instead it puts it towards this new entitlement. So you add up all of these programs, these new spending bills, and now as we're trying to ratchet them down, you know, we go to the former Speaker Pelosi, we put our bill out of the House, and she goes to the President, goes to the Senate leader and says, don't move any of this legislation. Just keep it on autopilot. Keep the spending. Don't ratchet down the spending. It's a big clash in Washington. It's not anybody's proud moment, but it's a big clash over whether we're going to start reducing the spending now and get us back towards something that's sustainable, or whether we're going to keep it up here and keep running these deficits. We can't afford to do that, and that's what the fight's about.
What's the alternative? What's the solution to this?
Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples. Do you think it makes sense to pay so many farmers in the United States to grow some crops and pay other farmers not to grow crops, and to have as many people in the U.S. Department of Agriculture as we've got in the Air Force? I mean, we've created these huge bureaucracies based on spending billions of dollars, and it's not helpful to the economy. It pushes up food prices, you know. It's not as though, you know, food's not going to be produced if you move off of these programs. That's just one example. But every government agency, every government department, since Reid and Pelosi became Speaker and leader in the Senate, every one of those went up double digits, all right? And so now we're trying to ratchet those agencies, departments down, because public employment's gone up as the private sector has shrunk. We got to get it back into balance.
So it's just really a review of what's historically take place to let us to this moment.
Exactly. It's a review of that and the question of whether we're going to change course or head right to the rocks, because that's where we're headed right now. Okay?
Thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, all right. You have a great day.
Okay, I appreciate it.
We invited him a while ago, and then because of the Washington, D.C., what's going on in Washington, they had to postpone. And today is the day, and here he is, Mr. Royce.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you today. And if I could sort of recap the last 800 days, pretty succinctly. It used to be in Washington, and this is based on our Constitution, that the government would pass a budget, and then you had to live within the budget. Now, a few years ago, our then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, discovered that you could go without a budget, and then you weren't so restrained. And now, it didn't look constitutional to us, but nevertheless, it set us on a new course. So yes, we passed a budget out of the House into the Senate. The Senate has gone 800 days without a budget. And Harry Reid has decided to pick up that little trick from the former Speaker of the House. And as a consequence, you can see that it's created a fair amount of excitement over how you govern without a budget and what you do to try to put us back on a glide path towards sustainability. Here's the problem. The deficits, which maybe 5 years ago were $160 billion, very bad, but they've gone up year by year so that it reached 1.6 trillion. And what we're trying to do now is ratchet down that spending increase that we saw under those years when Speaker Pelosi was increasing the budget by double digits every year. We're trying to get an agreement that will lead us back towards a glide path where the deficit is shrinking rather than increasing. We have a little difference of opinion. On the House side, we actually reduced government spending and the deficit. We cut by $6 trillion. But the President submitted his budget and he increases it over the next 10 years. He increases it by $9 trillion. Now that's a vast difference of opinion, right? We're trying to figure out a way to work this out so that it's acceptable, so we get a signature on the bill. And it is, I have to tell you, a conflict of visions in terms of where we're going to go. And I'll give you one example of an area where I've been active because I see it as a ready fix to solve two problems. There's criticism. I used to chair the Pork Busters Coalition. Criticism about corporate welfare. Well, I and a bipartisan group have put together a proposal to actually close corporate loopholes, but in exchange, trade it off for reducing the corporate tax a little bit. Why? Because our corporate tax rate is 8% higher than Europe's, than the average rate in Europe. And as a consequence, businesses expand in Europe and they don't send the revenues home, right? If we make this trade-off, according to the Congressional Budget Office, it looks neutral on paper, but over the next 10 years, it brings $750 billion new tax revenue into the coffers. Why? Because of economic growth. And that's where we need to go. We need economic growth. So we're pushing this as part of the solution. Right now, we've got sort of a temporary standoff where we've got to 2.3 trillion in reductions. That's not good enough, folks. We have to get to a $4 trillion reduction just to keep this thing sustainable, to keep it on a glide path where it's not getting worse and where the credit rating agencies aren't downgrading our debt. We need to go back into session. We need to tackle entitlement reform. Frankly, everything has to be on the table. Defense cuts have to be on the table. Entitlement reform has to be there. Discretionary spending cuts have to be there. Suggestions like I'm making here, where you close the corporate loopholes, but you bring down the corporate rate in exchange so that it brings more revenue into the coffers through economic growth. That has to be part of the solution. And we have to drive this debate out among the American public so that they understand what's at stake. Because at the end of the day, we cannot have a government where the Federal Reserve Chairman says this is unsustainable, and that's what he said in the President's budget. We cannot be governed by a budget that has an ever-increasing deficit. We are at a point in time where the decisions have to be made. So that is part of the debate. Now let me share with you another debate, and that is whether or not we're going to allow economic growth that's growth-inducing. There is an argument put forward that anything we do, and it doesn't matter whether it's solar. I mean, there's only one permit that I know of that's come down for solar. There's 176 of them on hold, right? Because it's growth-inducing. So it creates problems from the standpoint of those that are trying to hold this up. What kind of problems does that create for solar? Well, apparently, if you run the transmission lines to the solar projects out in the desert, There are the web-toed lizard, I think it is. There's a subspecies of lizard out there that could be impacted, arguably. My point is you cannot hold up 35 separate major energy projects in the state of California over these types of arguments. And frankly, you cannot hold up the Keystone Pipeline project, which seeks to bring fuel for the refineries across the United States out of Canada. You cannot hold that up. We've passed legislation recently over into the Senate to try to force the administration's hands on this. You cannot simultaneously block drilling in the Arctic when the Russians are bringing down their big rigs and planting them over the same oil field and are extracting that oil. I can tell you right now, with the advances that have been made in procedures, the U.S. is safer at drilling than Russia. You know, in the Caribbean, we compete now with the Venezuelans and the Spanish and the Chinese who are coming in and putting in rigs. As you see, we've got one of the major oil finds, and the administration is holding that up from going forward. And so it is off of the coast of Virginia, and so it is with energy jobs, whether it's wind or solar or coal. Frankly, our solution needs to be all of the above right now. We need to create as many jobs in the United States as we can. But we can't hold up permits for everything. And I've got to tell you one other thing. The regulatory burden right now that's coming down is so corrosive to economic growth and decision making and to businesses deploying their capital. And I'm just going to give you one example. Your community bankers here in the room saw the new study. 1.5 employees needed today to keep up with the new regulations that are coming down the pike every day, as opposed to the one employee who is working on loans in your community bank. Now that is tilted so unfavorably. Listen, races. As a matter of fact, personally, I transferred $1 million from my account and raised for these candidates over 80 new freshmen. I've gotten to know them all. You know, we're mentoring them as they come to Washington, D.C. And I can tell you this. They ran for the right reasons. They're professional people. They're business people. They're doctors. They're nurses. They're business people. They're women who've started, you know, who are involved in entrepreneurship. And they are very different, and they are determined that we are going to fix the way we do business in Washington and put it back on the right course. And I don't think they're going to be alone after the next election. I think in the United States Senate we're going to see the kinds of changes we saw in the House. Has ensured that it is not going to pan out, neither in the budget nor for the interests of patients. So these are all issues that we need to tackle, and I will. Do you want to take a few questions? Do you want me to answer a few questions and open it up? I think I should at this point. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question about the numbers that come out of Washington. I'm sure you're confused with them as well. But why don't we get back to a generally accepted accounting practice of the numbers? Because it seems like the budget goes up even though automatically every year.
Right,
why is that? Why don't we have zero-based budgeting?
Well, we should have zero-based budgeting. My background was finance and accounting. I'm a former controller. I'm a former corporate tax manager. I couldn't agree with you more. I think the reason it's been put on this system, I think it was done when Lyndon Johnson did the budget in a different way. I remember as a kid the debate over this. They changed it, and I think the reason they changed it with that unified budget, the way they did it, I think it was to disguise the size of the debt that was going forward. But you know, you can't disguise that from the market. The market knows it. And when the market sees the deficit increasing in an unsustainable way, you go into economic doldrums. I mean, because people know instinctively that you're headed towards what you see in Greece. You let this thing go too long without addressing the reforms necessary to bring this back into balance, and you get people so dependent upon, upon government, that then when you try to make the changes, it looks like the streets of Rome or the streets of Athens or the streets of London. That's not what we want in the United States. And frankly, you know, dependency is a very easy lesson to teach, my friends. I've seen it. Dependency is a lead pipe cinch to teach. Independence, it's a longer argument. You got to walk people through it. But to the extent that we try to adopt the social welfare model in Europe, we will get people too dependent upon government support at a time that we cannot sustain that. We cannot afford that. We have got to get better at expanding the private sectors, my friends, and shrinking the public sector, because that's where the real jobs and opportunity, upward social mobility is.
You know, is there a conflict between the states and the government in implementing energy policy?
Yes, absolutely, especially here in California. Because as bad as the federal rules are, the attitude in the state of California is worse. And it is not just on energy policy. It's also litigation. I've got a friend of mine around the corner. I'm trying to convince him not to move his business. He's looking at moving it to Texas because they have the British system, loser pay. So they don't have the class action lawsuits and all of that. And if you bring a frivolous suit and you lose, you know, it's loser pay. And so he wants to go to Texas because he's saying, on energy policy, you know, I've got a sane policy. On litigation, I don't have to worry. On taxation, I'm not worried about the taxes going up. Here in California, I'm worried about all of the above. So, you know, we've got to remember, we also compete with other states here in California besides competing around the world. And we have to have rational policies. And we're pushing for that. But we're not in sync, even with the federal, on energy.
Yeah, North Dakota, they have unemployment 3%. And they have oil. And they
Yes, that's right.
And here we're not doing anything.
That's true. Yes.
How do we back out the Federal Reserve from printing money?
Well, the good news internally is that the Fed governors who are concerned about what Bernanke did with QE1 and QE2
Like Fisher?
are speaking out. Fisher's speaking out very eloquently on this about why we can't do this again. And right now, I think they have the balance, hold the balance of power. And of course, what they're worried about is if we really go Argentinian model and, you know, inflate that way, you might be looking at the end of the road in Argentina-type solutions, which frankly did not work for Argentina. You know, you can't walk away from the debt. You've got to address it, and this is just basically you become an enabler if you do too much of this.
Well, like when they had the audit on the Federal Reserve, and the woman sits in the Congress who's in charge of it, and it says that she doesn't know what's going on, where the money's gone.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
She's in charge.
Listen, let me give you one other. For those of you who've read Friedrich Hayek or Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist, who studied the Great Depression, who studied depressions in Europe and here, one of their big concerns is the tendency for central banks to set interest rates too low. And if you'll remember back in, what was it, 2002, 3, 4, 5, there was 4 years running where the central bank set interest rates in the United States so low that it was actually below zero when you adjusted for inflation. Negative real interest rates. And I remember the London Economist, which I read, and it argued at the time, this is going to create a huge asset bubble in the United States. Everybody is going to borrow money at nothing. You know, at less than zero when you consider inflation to borrow it, and they're going to speculate. Is that true?
Yes.
Well, in 2005, according to the Federal Reserve figures, 30% of all homes were people flipping a home within 6 weeks. 30% of all transactions. Yes, we were creating an asset bubble for 4 years. That mistake was made, and as the London Economist argued, the central banks in Europe were sort of keeping up with what we were doing here. Not doing it quite as bad, but almost. And so we've got to get back to stable monetary policy, because once you build that huge, and let me share with you one other thing that happened, because I had the legislation in the House that Barney Frank railed against to allow the regulators to regulate for systemic risk 2 institutions, government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, Because what Barney Frank had done and other Democrats with the GSE Act in 1992, they had put out legislation that by the time Franklin Raines was heading up Fannie Mae, they were over leveraged by over 100 to 1 in the market, and there was affordable housing goals that were translated by HUD to say that 1/2 of your portfolio, now remember that portfolio then had grown to 1.6 trillion because of the over leveraging. 1/2 of that was to be in subprime. So can you imagine all of the junk that Countrywide was churning out? And I talked to a credit risk manager and he told me, we wait until the very last day of the quarter before we meet our goals and go out and buy all of that junk. Well, that was a message to the market to other people. Well, look, the government